The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood James Mitchell, a 28-year-old royal guard who had dedicated his life to serving the crown. His red uniform was pressed to perfection, his black bearskin hat stood tall and proud, and his face remained expressionless despite the chaos surrounding him. James had been stationed at this very spot for 3 years now. He knew every crack in the pavement, every sound the tourists made, and every possible disruption that could occur during his duty. What he didn't know was that today would change his life forever. The crowd was particularly thick that Tuesday morning. Tour buses had been arriving since dawn, discharging hundreds of visitors from around the world. Families with excited children, elderly couples with cameras, and groups of students all pushed forward, trying to get the perfect view of the ceremony that had remained unchanged for centuries. Among these tourists was a man who stood out from the rest. Victor Pemberton III was a 45-year-old American billionaire who owned a chain of luxury hotels across the globe. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, a Rolex watch that glittered in the sunlight, and an expression of barely concealed arrogance that seemed permanently etched on his face. Victor had flown to London in his private jet for what his assistant had called a cultural experience. In reality, he was here because his ex-wife had demanded he spend time with their 16-year-old son, Marcus, who had been getting into trouble at his expensive boarding school. The trip was meant to be educational and bonding, but Victor saw it as an inconvenience that kept him away from his business empire. Marcus Pemberton was nothing like his father. Where Victor was loud and demanding, Marcus was quiet and observant. The teenager had been reading about British history and was genuinely excited to see the royal guards. He had spent the previous evening in their 5-star hotel room, telling his father about the traditions and the significance of the ceremony they would witness. Victor had barely listened, too busy on phone calls with his business partners in New York. He saw this trip as a waste of time and made no effort to hide his impatience. To him, the guards were just men in funny hats performing an outdated ritual for the entertainment of tourists who had nothing better to do with their money. As the ceremony began, James took his position near the palace gates. His training had taught him to remain absolutely still, no matter what happened around him. He had endured rain, snow, extreme heat, and countless attempts by tourists to make him break character. Some would tell jokes, others would wave frantically, and a few would even try to touch his uniform or hat. Through it all, James remained a statue, embodying the discipline and honor of the Queen's Guard. The crowd pressed closer as the guards began their synchronized march. Children pointed excitedly, cameras flashed, and tour guides explained the history to their groups in multiple languages. The atmosphere was festive and respectful, with most tourists understanding they were witnessing something special. Victor, however, was growing increasingly irritated. The crowd was making him feel claustrophobic, and he couldn't understand why people were so fascinated by what he considered a meaningless display. He pulled out his phone to check his stock portfolio, muttering complaints under his breath about primitive tourist traps and waste of valuable time. Marcus tried to engage his father, pointing out different aspects of the ceremony and sharing facts he had learned from his research. "Dad, did you know that these guards are actual soldiers who have served in combat zones? They're not just for show, they're real military personnel with serious training and experience." But Victor waved him off dismissively. "It's all theater, son. Just men playing dress-up for tourists like us. Nothing more than an expensive puppet show designed to separate fools from their money." The teenager felt embarrassed by his father's loud comments, noticing how other tourists were beginning to stare and frown at them. He wished his father could see the dignity and honor in the tradition, but Victor seemed determined to find fault with everything around him. As the ceremony continued, a small child near the front of the crowd dropped her toy, a stuffed bear that rolled toward the guard's formation. James noticed the movement in his peripheral vision, but remained motionless as trained. The little girl started to cry, reaching toward her beloved toy that now lay just feet away from the imposing guard. The child's mother tried to comfort her while explaining that they couldn't retrieve the toy until after the ceremony. Other tourists around them offered sympathetic looks and quiet words of support, understanding the situation and showing patience with the crying child. Victor, however, saw this as yet another annoyance in what was already a frustrating morning. "Can't someone just grab the damn toy?" he said loudly enough for people around him to hear. "These guards are supposedly tough soldiers, but they can't even help a crying kid?" Marcus tugged on his father's sleeve. Dad, please keep your voice down. They're following protocol. It's not about being mean to the child. It's about maintaining the ceremony's integrity. But Victor was beyond caring about protocol or other people's feelings. His business empire had been built on the principle that rules were for other people, and he had never learned to accept situations where he couldn't simply buy his way to a different outcome. The ceremony reached its climax as the new guards took their positions, and the old guards prepared to march back to their barracks. The crowd began to disperse slowly, with many tourists lingering to take final photos and purchase souvenirs from nearby vendors. Victor checked his watch impatiently. They had dinner reservations at an exclusive restaurant that evening, and he wanted to return to the hotel to make some business calls before then. He began pushing through the crowd, using his size and aggressive demeanor to clear a path toward the exit. Move along, people, he announced loudly. The show's over. Time to get back to real life. As he forced his way through the crowd, Victor found himself directly in front of James, who remained at his post as the ceremony concluded. The guard stood perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, his breathing controlled and steady. Something about the guard's composure irritated Victor even more than the crying child had. Here was a man who was clearly ignoring him, showing no acknowledgement of his presence or importance. In Victor's world, everyone eventually recognized his wealth and status. Hotel managers rushed to accommodate him, restaurant owners personally ensured his satisfaction, and business associates competed for his attention. But this guard treated him like he was invisible, no different from any other tourist in the crowd. Victor felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. He was accustomed to controlling every situation, but here was someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or impressed. "Excuse me," Victor said loudly, stepping closer to James. "I'm talking to you." James remained motionless, following his training to ignore attempts at interaction during duty hours. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, his expression unchanged. Victor's face began to redden with frustration. "I said I'm talking to you. Don't you know who I am?" Marcus appeared at his father's side, looking mortified. "Dad, please stop. He's not allowed to talk during the ceremony. It's not personal, it's just his job." But Victor was beyond reason now. The combination of jet lag, business stress, and the general frustration of being in a situation he couldn't control had reached a boiling point. He saw the guard's silence not as professional duty, but as a personal insult to his authority and importance. "Listen here, toy soldier," Victor snarled, moving even closer to James. "I've spent more money in this country today than you make in a year. The least you could do is show some respect when someone of my caliber is speaking to you." The tourists around them began to notice the confrontation. Some stepped back, sensing trouble, while others pulled out their phones, recognizing that something significant was about to happen. A few British tourists looked particularly offended by Victor's behavior, but no one wanted to intervene in what appeared to be an escalating situation. James continued his stoic stance, though those closest to him might have noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes. His training had prepared him for many situations, but the combination of verbal abuse and the growing crowd of onlookers was testing his professional composure. Victor interpreted the guard's continued silence as defiance. In his world, silence from subordinates meant disrespect, and disrespect was something he had never tolerated. His business success had come partly from his willingness to destroy anyone who didn't acknowledge his superiority. "You think you're better than me?" Victor's voice grew louder, attracting even more attention. "You're nothing but a museum piece, a living mannequin for tourists to gawk at. I could buy and sell this entire palace if I wanted to." Marcus grabbed his father's arm, trying to pull him away. "Dad, everyone's watching. Please, let's just go." But Victor shook off his son's grip, his anger now completely overwhelming his judgment. He had reached a point where backing down would feel like weakness, and weakness was something Victor Pemberton III had never allowed himself to display. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people whispering and pointing. Some tourists were openly filming the confrontation, recognizing that they were witnessing something unusual and potentially historic. The atmosphere had shifted from the celebratory mood of the ceremony to something tense and uncomfortable. James remained perfectly still, but inside his mind was racing. He had encountered difficult tourists before, but never someone quite so aggressively persistent. His training emphasized maintaining composure no matter what, but every instinct told him that this situation was different from the usual attempts to make him break character. Victor looked around at the crowd, seeing their shocked expressions and recording devices. Instead of feeling embarrassed, he felt emboldened. Here was an audience for his display of power, witnesses to see how Victor Pemberton III dealt with those who dared to ignore him. "You want to play statue?" Victor said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Fine. But, in my world, statues don't get respect. They get what they deserve." What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones and shared millions of times around the world. In a moment of absolute arrogance and complete loss of control, Victor Pemberton III did something that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. He spat directly in James Mitchell's face. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound that seemed to echo off the palace walls. Several people screamed in shock and outrage. The moment stretched out like something from a nightmare, with the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in for everyone present. Marcus stood frozen in horror, his face pale with embarrassment and disbelief. He had always known his father could be difficult, but this level of disrespect towards someone who was clearly just doing his job was beyond anything he had ever witnessed. The other tourists began shouting in multiple languages, their anger evident even when the words weren't understood. Some demanded that someone call the police, while others expressed sympathy for the guard who had just been publicly humiliated. James felt the warm saliva running down his cheek, but his training held. He didn't move, didn't wipe his face, didn't react in any visible way. Inside, however, something fundamental was shifting. This wasn't just about maintaining professional composure anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and how a person chooses to respond when faced with the very worst of human behavior. Victor seemed surprised by his own action, but instead of showing remorse, he doubled down on his aggression. "That's what happens when you disrespect your betters," he announced to the crowd, as if he had just delivered some kind of justice rather than committed an act of shocking cruelty. The scene was being broadcast live on social media as tourists uploaded their videos immediately. Within minutes, the footage would begin spreading across platforms around the world, with millions of people witnessing the moment when a wealthy American tourist spat on a British royal guard. But what none of them knew yet was how James Mitchell would respond. The guard who had dedicated his life to service, who had maintained his composure through 3 years of duty at one of the world's most visited tourist attractions, was about to do something that would shock everyone, including himself. As the crowd continued to express their outrage, and Victor stood there with a satisfied smirk on his face, James slowly began to move for the first time in hours. What he would do next would be talked about for years to come, and would teach Victor Pemberton III a lesson about respect that no amount of money could ever buy. James Mitchell slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. The crowd watched in absolute silence as he carefully wiped the saliva from his face, his movements deliberate and dignified. When he finished, he folded the handkerchief precisely and returned it to his pocket, all while maintaining his military bearing. Then, for the first time in 3 years of service at this post, James spoke while on duty. "Sir," he said in a clear, calm voice that carried across the silent crowd, "I believe you've made a mistake." Victor's smirk faltered slightly. He had expected anger, retaliation, or perhaps for the guard to break down and abandon his post. The quiet dignity in James's response was not what he had anticipated. "My name is James Mitchell," the guard continued, his voice steady and professional. "I've served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq before joining the Queen's Guard. I've seen combat, lost friends, and dedicated my life to protecting others. But I've never encountered disrespect quite like what you've just shown." The crowd remained transfixed. This was unprecedented, a royal guard speaking publicly, abandoning protocol to address a situation that had clearly gone beyond normal bounds. "I've been standing here for 3 hours," James continued, "maintaining this position not because I'm a statue or a museum piece, but because I represent something larger than myself. I represent the honor and tradition of my country, the memory of soldiers who came before me, and the respect we show to institutions that have protected freedom for centuries." Victor opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in James's steady gaze made him hesitate. There was no anger in the guard's eyes, no hatred or desire for revenge. Instead, there was something far more powerful, a quiet strength that came from absolute certainty in his own values. "You asked if I know who you are," James said. "I don't, and, frankly, it doesn't matter. What matters is who you choose to be in moments like this. And, right now, sir, you've chosen to be someone who spits on a fellow human being who was doing nothing more than his job." Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm so sorry, he said to James, his voice cracking with emotion. My father, he's not usually. I mean, this isn't. The teenager struggled to find words that could somehow excuse or explain what had just happened. James looked at the young man with kindness. You're not responsible for anyone's actions, but your own, son. And, from what I can see, you understand the difference between right and wrong. Victor finally found his voice again, though it lacked the confidence he had displayed moments earlier. Now see here, I didn't come to London to be lectured by somewhat. James interrupted quietly. Some soldier? Some human being? Some person who chose to serve his country instead of himself? The questions hung in the air like a challenge. Victor realized that every word he said was being recorded by dozens of phones, broadcast live to the world. For the first time in years, he found himself in a situation where his wealth and influence offered no protection from the consequences of his actions. I think, James continued, that you've spent so much time being important in your own world that you've forgotten how to behave in the real world. Money can buy many things, sir, but it can't buy respect, and it certainly can't buy back your dignity once you've thrown it away. An elderly British woman in the crowd called out, "Shame on you," directed at Victor. Others began to murmur their agreement, and the atmosphere grew increasingly hostile toward the American businessman. James raised his hand slightly, and, remarkably, the crowd quieted. Please, he said, addressing the onlookers. This gentleman has already embarrassed himself enough for one day. Let's not make this worse than it needs to be. Victor was stunned by the guard's intervention on his behalf. Even after being publicly humiliated, James was protecting him from the crowd's anger. It was a level of grace and maturity that Victor recognized he had never displayed in his own life. I don't understand, Victor said, his voice much quieter now. Why are you helping me? James considered the question carefully. Because that's what decent people do, sir. We don't let our worst moments define us. And we don't let other people's worst moments turn us into something we're not. A police officer approached the scene, having been alerted by palace security about the disturbance. Sergeant Patricia Williams had been working this beat for 15 years and had seen her share of tourist incidents. But the crowd's unusual behavior and the obvious tension in the air suggested this was something different. What's the situation here? She asked, looking between James, Victor, and the gathered crowd. Several tourists immediately began speaking at once, trying to explain what had happened. The sergeant held up her hand for quiet and turned to James. Officer Mitchell, what's your report? James hesitated for a moment. He could have Victor arrested for assault. The entire incident had been recorded from multiple angles, and there were dozens of witnesses. It would be an open and shut case that would likely result in deportation and international humiliation for the American businessman. But, as James looked at Marcus, who was standing beside his father with tears of shame in his eyes, he made a decision that would surprise everyone. There was a misunderstanding, Sergeant Williams. A tourist got a bit too enthusiastic during the ceremony, but no harm was done. I think everyone involved has learned something from the experience. Victor's mouth fell open. The guard was protecting him, covering for him, giving him a chance to walk away from this situation without legal consequences. It was an act of mercy that Victor knew he didn't deserve. Sergeant Williams looked skeptical. Are you certain, Officer Mitchell? Some of these witnesses seemed quite upset about something. I'm certain, James replied firmly. Sometimes the best justice is the justice we carry in our own hearts. The sergeant nodded slowly, though she clearly sensed there was more to the story. Very well, but I suggest all tourists remember that our guards are to be treated with respect. This is not a theme park. These are real soldiers doing real work. As the officer moved away to disperse the crowd, Victor found himself alone with James and Marcus. The other tourists were slowly moving on, though many continued to watch from a distance, and some were still recording. Why? Victor asked, his voice barely audible. Why didn't you have me arrested? James was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Tell me, sir, do you have other children besides your son here? The question seemed random, but Victor nodded. 2 daughters from my first marriage. They're older, in college now. And do they respect you? Victor's face clouded with pain. We don't talk much anymore. Haven't for years, actually. Why do you think that is? Victor looked at Marcus, who was watching this exchange with fascination. For the first time, he really looked at his son, not as an inconvenience or an obligation, but as a young man who was forming his own opinions about what kind of person his father was. I suppose, Victor said slowly, they don't like who I've become. And who have you become? James asked gently. Victor struggled with the question. For decades, he had defined himself by his wealth, his power, his ability to control situations and people. But standing here, having just committed an act of inexcusable rudeness in front of his son and hundreds of strangers, those definitions felt hollow. Someone I don't recognize, he finally admitted. Marcus stepped closer to his father, tears still visible in his eyes. Dad, I was so proud to come here with you today. I wanted to share something I thought was beautiful and meaningful. But when you did that, his voice broke. I was ashamed to be your son. The words hit Victor like a physical blow. He had been called many things in his business life, ruthless, demanding, uncompromising, but he had never been told by his own child that he was a source of shame. James watched the exchange with growing understanding. Mr. Pemberton, that is your name, isn't it? Victor nodded, surprised that the guard had somehow learned his identity. Your son has been trying to tell you about the history and significance of what we do here. Have you been listening? Not really, Victor admitted. I thought it was all just pageantry. May I tell you a story? James asked. Victor nodded, feeling like a child who had been called to the principal's office. My great-grandfather served in World War I. He was a private in the trenches in France, fighting to protect the freedoms we enjoy today. He saw friends die, suffered through gas attacks, and lived in conditions that would break most modern people. James paused, his eyes distant with memory of stories passed down through his family. When he came home, he was offered a position in the King's Guard, what we now call the Queen's Guard. Do you know why he accepted? Victor shook his head. Because he understood that freedom isn't free, and that honor isn't just a word. It's a choice you make every day to be better than your worst impulses, to serve something larger than yourself, and to treat other people with dignity regardless of whether they can do anything for you in return. Marcus was listening intently, and even Victor found himself drawn into the story. My great-grandfather stood in positions like this one for 30 years. Through rain and shine, through the Blitz during World War II, through celebrations and mourning, through the changing of monarchs and the changing of times. He never once broke character, never once forgot that he represented something sacred. James's voice grew stronger as he continued. When he retired, they asked him what had kept him going all those years. Do you know what he said? Victor waited. He said, every day I stood guard. I remembered that somewhere, someone was counting on me to do my duty. Maybe it was the Queen, maybe it was my family, maybe it was just some tourist who needed to see that there were still people in the world who kept their promises. The story hung in the air between them, and Victor felt something shifting inside his chest, a recognition of values he had forgotten he once possessed. I've been standing guard here for 3 years, James continued. And every day, I remember my great-grandfather's words. Today, when you spat on me, you weren't just disrespecting a person. You were disrespecting the memory of every soldier who ever stood watch, every person who ever sacrificed for others, every individual who chose duty over comfort. Victor felt tears forming in his eyes, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. I didn't understand, he whispered. But now you do, James said simply. And that's what matters. Understanding can come at any age, from any experience. The question is what you do with it. Marcus looked at his father with something approaching hope. Dad, can we start over? Can we try to see things differently? Victor looked at his son, then at James, then at the crowd of tourists who were still watching this unprecedented interaction between a guard and a visitor. For the first time in years, he saw himself through other people's eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. But he also saw an opportunity, a chance to be the kind of person his son could be proud of, the kind of man who deserved respect rather than simply demanding it. Yes, he said quietly. Yes, I think we can. James nodded approvingly. That's the beginning of wisdom, sir. Recognizing when you need to change and having the courage to actually do it. The guard then did something that surprised everyone present. He extended his hand to Victor in a gesture of reconciliation and respect. Victor stared at the offered hand for a moment, understanding the magnitude of the gesture. This man, whom he had publicly humiliated just minutes earlier, was offering him friendship and forgiveness. It was a lesson in grace that Victor knew he would never forget. He took James's hand, and, as they shook, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine human connection based on mutual respect rather than fear or financial obligation. Thank you, Victor said, and for the first time that day, his words carried genuine emotion. I'm sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry. Apology accepted, James replied. Now, I believe your son had some things he wanted to share with you about this place. If you'd like, I can answer any questions you might have during my break in 20 minutes. Marcus's face lit up with excitement and gratitude. Really? You do that? It would be my pleasure, James said. Education is part of our mission here. And I have a feeling you've done your homework. As Victor watched his son beam with happiness, he realized that this conversation with a royal guard who had shown him more grace than he deserved, might be the most important 20 minutes of his life. 20 minutes later, James approached the small bench where Victor and Marcus had been waiting. He had changed from his ceremonial uniform into casual clothes, jeans, and a simple button-down shirt that made him look like any other young man in London. Without the imposing uniform and bearskin hat, Victor could see that James was probably close to his son's age when he first enlisted. "Thank you for waiting," James said, settling onto the bench beside them. "I hope you don't mind that I changed clothes. It's easier to have a normal conversation when I'm not in full ceremonial gear." Marcus immediately pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten questions and observations. "I've been reading about the Guard's history for weeks," he said excitedly. "Did you really serve in combat before joining?" James nodded. "2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. I joined the army when I was 18, straight out of secondary school. My father wasn't particularly pleased with the decision." "Why not?" Victor asked, genuinely curious. "He wanted me to go to university, study business or law, something that would lead to financial success. He came from a generation that had fought in the Falklands, and he knew firsthand the sacrifices military service requires. He was worried about my safety, and he wanted better opportunities for me than he felt he'd had." Victor felt a pang of recognition. What changed his mind? James smiled. "Nothing, initially. He was furious when I enlisted. We didn't speak for almost 6 months. But after my first tour, when I came home and told him about the schools we'd helped build and the people we'd protected, he began to understand that service isn't just about personal advancement." "What made you want to serve in the first place?" Marcus asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "Honestly, I was angry about the terrorist attacks in London back in 2005. I was just 13 then, but I remember watching the news coverage and feeling helpless. I wanted to do something to protect people, to make sure that kind of hatred couldn't win." Victor listened intently, trying to understand a mindset that was completely foreign to his own experience. "Weren't you afraid?" "Terrified," James admitted without hesitation. "Anyone who says they're not afraid in combat is either lying or mentally unstable. But fear isn't the opposite of courage. It's the raw material courage is made from." Marcus scribbled notes frantically. "What was it like? The fighting, I mean." James was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "It's not like the movies, that's for certain. It's mostly long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror. But it's also meaningful. When you're protecting a convoy bringing medical supplies to a village, or when you're helping evacuate civilians from a dangerous area, you know exactly why you're there." "Did you ever question whether it was worth it?" Victor asked. "Every day," James replied honestly, "especially after we lost someone. I lost 3 close friends during my deployments. Good men who died trying to help people they'd never met, and who couldn't even speak their language." Victor felt ashamed of his earlier dismissal of the guards as toy soldiers. "How do you deal with that kind of loss? You remember why they chose to serve, and you honor their memory by continuing to serve. My friend Danny used to say that the best way to respect the dead is to live a life worthy of their sacrifice." Marcus looked up from his notes. "Is that why you joined the Queen's Guard?" "Partly," James said. "When I finished my active duty, I could have left the military entirely. I had job offers from private security firms that would have paid much better. But I wasn't ready to stop serving. The Guard seemed like a way to continue protecting something important while staying connected to the traditions that shaped me." Victor struggled to understand this mindset. "But the pay must be terrible," James finished with a laugh. "I make less in a year than some people spend on a car. But I have something that money can't buy, the knowledge that what I do matters." "How does it matter?" Victor asked. "I mean, you're not in active combat anymore. You're standing guard at a tourist attraction." James considered the question seriously. "Do you know what this place represents, Mr. Pemberton?" Victor shook his head. "Continuity," James said simply. "For over 1,000 years, there have been guards protecting the monarch. Through wars, revolutions, plagues, social upheavals, and technological changes that our ancestors couldn't have imagined, this tradition has remained unbroken." He gestured toward the palace behind them. "When people come here from around the world, they're not just seeing guards in funny hats. They're seeing proof that some things endure, that not everything in human civilization is temporary and disposable." Marcus was writing furiously, trying to capture every word. After September 11th, James continued. After the London bombings, after all the attacks around the world that try to make us afraid of each other, people need to see that stability and honor still exist. They need to know that there are still people willing to stand guard, literally and figuratively, over the values that make civilization possible. Victor felt something stirring in his chest, a recognition of ideals he had once held but had forgotten somewhere along the way to accumulating wealth and power. When I was young, Victor said quietly, I wanted to be a teacher. Both James and Marcus looked at him in surprise. I studied education in college, Victor continued. I wanted to work with inner-city kids, help them see possibilities beyond their circumstances. I thought education was the key to solving most of the world's problems. What happened? Marcus asked, genuinely curious about this side of his father he'd never known. Victor sighed deeply. Life happened. Student loans, pressure from my family to be practical, opportunities in business that seemed too good to pass up. I told myself I'd make money first, and then go back to teaching later. But later never came. It's not too late, James said gently. I know people who've changed careers at 50, 60, even 70. If you still feel called to teach, that calling doesn't have an expiration date. Victor shook his head. I wouldn't even know where to start. Besides, I've been in business for so long. I'm not sure I remember how to put other people's needs first. With respect, sir, James said, I think you're selling yourself short. This morning, after what happened between us, you could have stormed off angry, or demanded to speak to my superior, or used your wealth and influence to try to get me in trouble. Instead, you stayed and listened. That tells me you still have the instincts of a teacher. Marcus looked at his father with new interest. Dad, I had no idea you wanted to be a teacher. Why didn't you ever tell me? Victor felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that was deeply unfamiliar. Because I was ashamed, I suppose. I've spent your entire life telling you about the importance of success and achievement, but I never told you about the dreams I gave up to pursue those things. What kind of teaching did you want to do? James asked. History, Victor replied. I wanted to help kids understand how the past connects to the present, how the choices people made centuries ago still affect us today. I thought if young people understood history better, they'd make better decisions about the future. James smiled. That's exactly what I try to do when I give tours to school groups. History isn't just dates and names. It's lessons about human nature, about the consequences of our choices, about the ongoing struggle between our best and worst instincts. Marcus closed his notebook and looked directly at his father. Dad, what if you went back to teaching? You have enough money that you don't need to worry about salary. You could teach anywhere you wanted. Victor laughed, but it wasn't a bitter sound. Your mother would think I'd lost my mind. Mom's not married to you anymore, Marcus pointed out. Maybe it's time to worry less about what other people think and more about what makes you feel alive. The wisdom in his 16-year-old son's words struck Victor like a revelation. When had he started making decisions based on other people's expectations rather than his own values? James, Victor said, turning to the young guard. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever regret the path you've chosen? Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd pursued money instead of service? James thought about the question carefully. I think everyone wonders about the paths they didn't take. But regret? No. I've seen enough of the world to know that wealth without purpose is just another form of poverty. What do you mean? I've been stationed at embassies and worked with very wealthy people during my military service. I've seen people who have everything money can buy but who are miserable because they've never found anything worth serving that's bigger than themselves. Victor felt as though James was describing his exact situation. The happiest people I've met, James continued, weren't necessarily the richest or most successful in conventional terms. They were people who had found a way to use their talents and resources to make other people's lives better. Marcus had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. Dad, what if you started a foundation? You could use your business experience to create educational programs, but focus on the kind of teaching you always wanted to do. Victor looked at his son with amazement. How did you get so wise? I've been paying attention, Marcus replied. I've watched you in business meetings, seen how you solve problems and motivate people. You're actually a really good teacher. You just never applied those skills to education. James nodded approvingly. Your son has a point. Leadership and teaching aren't that different. Both require understanding people, communicating clearly, and inspiring others to be their best selves. For the first time in years, Victor felt a spark of genuine excitement about the future. I have no idea how to start something like that. That's okay, James said. Most worthwhile things begin with not knowing how to do them. The important thing is being willing to learn and to serve something bigger than your own interests. Victor looked around at the tourists still flowing past the palace gates, families and individuals from all over the world who had come to witness something they considered meaningful and beautiful. For the first time, he understood what they were really seeing. James, he said, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened this morning. I've spent so many years thinking that people like you, people who serve others, were naive or weak. I thought the only smart way to live was to accumulate as much power and wealth as possible. And now, James asked, now I think I've been the naive one. I thought money would make me happy, would make me respected, would give my life meaning. But this morning, a young man who makes a fraction of what I make showed me more dignity and strength than I've ever displayed. Marcus reached over and squeezed his father's hand. It's not too late to change, Dad. It's never too late to become the person you want to be. Victor squeezed back, feeling a connection with his son that had been missing for years. You really think I could do it? Leave business and go into education. I think, James said, that the question isn't whether you could do it, but whether you're brave enough to try. After all, if you can build a business empire, you can certainly learn to build minds and character. As they sat together on the bench, watching the endless stream of visitors to one of the world's most famous landmarks, Victor felt something he hadn't experienced since he was young. Hope for a future that would be about more than just accumulating wealth and power. The man who had spat on a royal guard that morning was discovering that the guard's response hadn't just taught him about respect and dignity. It had reminded him of dreams he thought he'd lost forever, and shown him that it's never too late to choose a different path. 6 months later, Victor Pemberton stood nervously outside a classroom in East London, holding a folder full of lesson plans he'd been working on for weeks. The building was old and tired, with peeling paint and windows that needed replacing, but it housed something that had become precious to him, his chance at redemption. After returning to New York from London, Victor had made the most difficult decision of his life. He sold his controlling interest in his hotel empire to his business partners and used the proceeds to establish the Pemberton Foundation for Educational Excellence. The foundation's mission was simple: to bring quality history education to underserved communities around the world. The transition hadn't been easy. Victor's ex-wife thought he'd suffered a nervous breakdown. His business associates questioned his sanity, and financial magazines ran stories about his mysterious departure from the corporate world with headlines like "Billionaire's Bizarre Career Change" and "From Boardroom to Classroom." Has Victor Pemberton lost his mind? But through it all, Marcus had been his greatest supporter. The teenager had deferred his acceptance to several prestigious universities to spend a gap year, helping his father establish the foundation. Their relationship, damaged by years of Victor's focus on wealth over family, had grown stronger than it had ever been. Are you ready, Dad? Marcus asked, appearing beside him in the hallway. Over the past 6 months, Marcus had grown taller and more confident, taking on responsibilities that would have been unimaginable for most 16-year-olds. Victor took a deep breath. I think so. Though I have to admit, I'm more nervous than I was before my first business presentation. That's because this matters more, Marcus observed wisely. Through the classroom window, Victor could see 23 students ranging in age from 14 to 17. They came from some of London's most challenging neighborhoods, students who had been written off by traditional educational systems, but who had volunteered to participate in the Foundation's pilot program. The program was Victor's attempt to bring history to life for young people who saw little connection between the past and their own futures. Instead of memorizing dates and names, students would explore historical themes through interactive experiences, field trips, and connections to contemporary issues. Mr. Pemberton, a young teacher named Sarah Chen, approached them in the hallway. She was the local coordinator Victor had hired to help implement the program, a brilliant educator who had been working in East London schools for 5 years. Please, call me Victor, he said, still adjusting to being addressed as something other than Sir or Mr. Pemberton III. The students are excited to meet you, Sarah said. Though I should warn you, they're also skeptical. They've had a lot of promises made to them by well-meaning people who didn't follow through. Victor nodded. He understood their skepticism. What have you told them about me? Just that you're someone who decided to change careers because you believe education can change the world. I thought it would be better if they heard your story directly from you. As they entered the classroom, Victor felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. The students looked up with expressions ranging from curious to guarded to openly suspicious. These weren't the polite, privileged children he had encountered at Marcus's private school events. These were young people who had learned to be cautious about adults bearing gifts and making promises. "Good morning," Victor said, his voice carrying the confidence he'd developed in decades of business presentations, but softened with genuine warmth. "My name is Victor Pemberton, and I'm here because 6 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life in front of my son and hundreds of strangers." The students perked up with interest. This wasn't the usual adult introduction they were accustomed to hearing. "How many of you have ever done something you were deeply ashamed of?" Victor asked. Most hands went up, some hesitantly, others with the confidence of young people who had already faced significant challenges. "Well, I did something so embarrassing, so disrespectful, and so completely wrong that it was recorded on dozens of phones and shared millions of times on social media." A few students pulled out their phones, clearly thinking about searching for whatever video he was referencing. Victor laughed. "Go ahead and look it up if you want. Search for rich tourist spits on Royal Guard. I'll wait." The classroom erupted in activity as students frantically searched. Within moments, several had found the video, and Victor could hear the sharp intakes of breath as they watched the incident that had changed his life. "That's me," Victor said simply. 6 months ago, I was a billionaire businessman who thought money made me better than other people. I was rude, arrogant, and completely lacking in respect for a young soldier who was just doing his job. One student, a girl named Amara with bright purple hair, raised her hand. "What happened after you did that?" "The guard taught me the most important lesson of my life," Victor replied. "He showed me what real strength looks like, what genuine dignity means, and what it truly means to serve something bigger than yourself." Marcus stepped forward. "That guard is here today, actually. We invited him to help launch the program." Victor's heart jumped. He hadn't seen James since that day in London, though they had exchanged emails as Victor planned the foundation. James had been instrumental in helping design the curriculum, offering insights into how historical service and sacrifice could be made relevant to modern students. The classroom door opened, and James Mitchell walked in, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a soldier. The students immediately recognized him from the viral video, and excited murmurs filled the room. "Hello, everyone," James said with a warm smile. "I'm James, and I'm here because Victor and Marcus convinced me that young people like you might be interested in learning about history from someone who's actually lived a bit of it." Amara raised her hand again. "Why didn't you have him arrested? I mean, he spat on you in front of everyone." James looked at Victor with a slight smile before answering. "Because I realized that humiliating someone publicly rarely changes their heart. Real change comes from understanding, from connection, and from giving people the chance to be better than their worst moment." "But weren't you angry?" asked a boy named Devin, who looked like he had personal experience with anger and its consequences. "Furious," James admitted honestly. "For about 30 seconds, I wanted to break protocol and respond with anger. But my training taught me something important. The moment you let someone else's bad behavior control your actions, you've lost your power to choose who you want to be." Victor watched the students process this response. These were young people who lived in a world where respect was often earned through aggression, where showing weakness could be dangerous, and where hitting back was frequently seen as the only option. "So you chose to be what?" Devin asked, clearly struggling with the concept. "Better," James said simply. "I chose to be better than the situation, better than his behavior, and better than my own initial impulses." Sarah Chun stepped forward. "This is exactly what our program is about. History is full of people who faced impossible situations and had to choose what kind of person they wanted to be. We're going to explore those choices and what we can learn from them." For the next 2 hours, Victor and James worked together to introduce the students to their first historical case study, the Christmas Truce of 1914, when British and German soldiers spontaneously stopped fighting during World War I to celebrate Christmas together in no man's land. Victor was amazed at how engaged the students became as James described the realities of trench warfare, and Victor connected the soldiers' choice to modern examples of conflict resolution. These young people, who teachers had told him were difficult to motivate, asked insightful questions and made connections that surprised even their regular instructors. "So you're saying," said a quiet girl named Zara, "that even in the middle of a war, people could choose to see their enemies as human beings?" "Exactly," Victor replied. "And the question we should ask ourselves is, If soldiers in the trenches could make that choice, what choices are available to us in our daily conflicts? Devin, who had seemed skeptical at the beginning of the class, raised his hand. This is different from regular history class. How so? James asked. Usually, they just tell us what happened and when. But you're asking us what we would have done, what we think about it. Like our opinions matter. Victor felt a surge of emotion. Your opinions absolutely matter, Devin. History isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding human nature so we can make better choices in the future. As the class continued, Victor found himself remembering why he had wanted to teach in the first place. There was something magical about watching young minds engage with big ideas, about seeing students make connections between historical events and their own lives. When the session ended, several students lingered to ask more questions. Amara approached Victor directly. Mr. Pemberton, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you miss being rich? I mean, you gave up a lot to do this. Victor considered the question carefully. I miss some things about having unlimited money, he said honestly. But I don't miss the person I was when I had it. Money never made me feel the way I felt today, watching you and your classmates think critically about important questions. What way is that? Useful, Victor replied. For the first time in years, I feel like my life has a purpose beyond just accumulating more wealth. James overheard this exchange and approached them. Victor, can I tell you something that happened after you left London? Of course. I started getting letters from people around the world who had seen that video. Not angry letters. Letters from people thanking me for showing them that it was possible to respond to cruelty with dignity. Apparently, watching how I handled that situation inspired people to make different choices in their own conflicts. Victor was stunned. I had no idea. Your worst moment, James continued, became a teaching moment for millions of people. And now, through this foundation, you're turning that experience into something even more positive. Marcus joined their conversation. Dad, you know what I think is amazing about all this? What? 6 months ago, you were angry at James for not acknowledging your importance. Today, 23 students who never heard of you before this morning were hanging on your every word. Real respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by serving others. Victor looked around the classroom, where students were still engaged in animated discussions about the historical scenarios they had explored. Sarah Chun was answering questions, James was showing photos from his military service, and the energy in the room was unlike anything Victor had experienced in a corporate boardroom. You know what the strangest thing is? Victor said to his son. What? I've never felt more successful in my life. As they prepared to leave the school, Amara approached Victor one more time. Mr. Pemberton, will you come back next week? Every week, Victor promised. This is what I do now. Good, she said with a smile. Because I think you're a much better teacher than you were a businessman. Walking out of the school with his son and James, Victor reflected on how completely his life had changed. 6 months ago, his definition of success had been about accumulating wealth and power. Today, success meant inspiring a purple-haired teenager to think differently about history and human nature. The man who had once spat on a royal guard had learned that the guard's response wasn't just about dignity in the moment. It was about the long-term impact of choosing grace over revenge, understanding over anger, and service over self-interest. And, in teaching others about those choices, Victor was finally becoming the person he had always had the potential to be. 2 years later, Victor Pemberton stood before an audience of 500 educators, philanthropists, and students at the Royal Geographic Society in London. The Pemberton Foundation had grown beyond his wildest dreams, operating programs in 12 countries and reaching over 10,000 students annually. Tonight, he was receiving the Queen's Award for Educational Excellence. But, more importantly, he was about to share the stage with the person who had made it all possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. 2 years ago, I stood in the shadow of Buckingham Palace as the worst version of myself. I was a man who had confused wealth with worth, power with purpose, and success with significance. The audience listened intently. Many had heard versions of this story, but Victor's willingness to publicly examine his own failures never failed to captivate listeners. That day, I encountered a young man who taught me that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself. True dignity isn't about demanding respect. It's about living in a way that naturally earns it. And true success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute. Victor paused, scanning the audience until his eyes found a familiar face in the third row. James Mitchell sat between Marcus, now 18, and enrolled at Cambridge University studying history and education, and Sarah Chun, who had become the Foundation's Director of Curriculum Development. I want to share with you some of the lessons we've learned through our work with young people around the world, because these lessons apply far beyond education. They're about how we choose to respond when life challenges us to become better than we thought possible. Over the past 2 years, the Foundation's programs had evolved based on feedback from students, teachers, and communities. What had started as history education had grown into something much more comprehensive, a character education program that used historical examples to help young people develop critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and ethical reasoning skills. In our first year, Victor continued, we worked with 1,200 students across 5 cities. We expected them to learn about history. We didn't expect them to teach us about resilience, hope, and the power of believing in someone's potential for change. He clicked to the first slide in his presentation, showing a photo of Amara, the purple-haired student from their pilot program in East London. She was now studying international relations at university on a scholarship the Foundation had helped her secure. Amara wrote to us recently about her experience in our program. She said, "You taught me that history isn't about memorizing what dead people did. It's about understanding that every generation faces the same basic choice, whether to repeat the mistakes of the past or to learn from them and do better." The audience murmured appreciatively, and Victor could see James smiling with pride. But the most important lesson we've learned is this: transformation is possible at any age, in any circumstance, if we're willing to look honestly at ourselves and commit to growth. Victor told the story of Marcus Thompson, a student from Detroit who had been involved with gangs before joining the Foundation's program. Marcus had been inspired by learning about conflict resolution techniques used by historical figures like Nelson Mandela and had gone on to become a peer mediator in his community, helping other young people find alternatives to violence. Marcus taught us that knowledge becomes wisdom only when it's applied to real life. Historical examples aren't just interesting stories. They're blueprints for how to handle modern challenges. The presentation continued with examples from programs around the world. Students in Mumbai learning about the civil rights movement and applying its lessons to local social justice issues. Teenagers in Sao Paulo studying the Berlin Wall and drawing connections to the barriers that divide their own communities. Young people in Johannesburg exploring post-conflict reconciliation and using those insights to address ongoing inequalities. Each of these programs succeeded because we started with a fundamental assumption that every young person, regardless of their background or circumstances, has the capacity for moral reasoning and ethical leadership. We just need to give them tools and opportunities to develop those capabilities. Victor paused to take a sip of water, collecting his thoughts before moving to the most personal part of his presentation. 2 years ago, when that viral video of my shameful behavior spread around the world, I received thousands of messages. Most were rightfully critical of my actions, but some were different. Some were from people who said they had done similar things, maybe not as public, maybe not as dramatic, but moments when they had acted in ways that contradicted their deepest values. He looked directly at James, whose steady presence had become a source of strength during the challenging early days of the Foundation. Those messages taught me that moral failure isn't rare or exceptional. It's part of the human condition. What's rare is what happened to me. The opportunity to learn from someone who responded to cruelty with grace, and the chance to transform that learning into something constructive. Victor clicked to a new slide showing a graph of the Foundation's impact metrics, graduation rates, university enrollment, community service hours, and leadership positions held by program participants. These numbers tell an important story, but they don't tell the whole story. Because the real impact of our work can't be measured in statistics. It's measured in moments of choice, when a young person decides to respond to conflict with dialogue instead of violence, or when they choose to serve others instead of just themselves. The audience was completely engaged now, and Victor felt the familiar energy that came from sharing something he deeply believed in. We've learned that character education isn't about preaching morality. It's about examining real situations where people faced difficult choices and discussing what we can learn from their decisions. When students study how Frederick Douglass chose education over despair, or how Malala chose advocacy over silence, they begin to see their own challenges differently. Victor shared the story of the Foundation's program in Belfast, where Catholic and Protestant teenagers worked together on projects examining how communities had overcome historical divisions. The program had been so successful that it was being adapted for use in other post-conflict regions. In Belfast, we learned that young people are often more capable of transcending old divisions than adults are. When teenagers from different backgrounds work together on shared projects, they naturally focus on what they have in common rather than what divides them. He paused, remembering a particularly powerful moment from his visit to the Belfast program 6 months earlier. A 17-year-old named Patrick told us, "Learning about how people in other places overcame hatred helped me realize that the conflicts in my neighborhood aren't permanent or inevitable. They're choices that each generation can make differently." Victor looked out at the audience, seeing educators, foundation executives, and young people who were all part of the growing movement to integrate character development with academic learning. This brings me to the most important point of tonight's presentation. The work we're doing isn't really about history education, and it's not even primarily about character development. It's about helping young people develop what I call moral imagination, the ability to envision themselves as people who make choices based on their highest values rather than their immediate impulses. He clicked to a slide showing the Foundation's latest initiative, a global network connecting students from different countries to work together on projects addressing shared challenges like climate change, poverty, and social inequality. Next year, we're launching our Global Leaders Program, which will bring together 500 students from 25 countries to work on real-world problems using the ethical reasoning skills they've developed through our historical case studies. Victor's voice grew stronger as he described the program's potential impact. These young people will graduate not just with academic knowledge, but with practical experience in collaborative problem-solving, cross-cultural communication, and ethical leadership. They'll be prepared to tackle challenges that my generation has struggled to address effectively. As he neared the end of his presentation, Victor reflected on how much his own perspective had changed since that humiliating day at Buckingham Palace. 2 years ago, I measured my worth by my wealth. Today, I measure it by whether I've helped young people develop the tools they need to make the world better than they found it. He clicked to his final slide, which showed a simple quote. "Character is how you treat people who can do nothing for you." This quote captures what James Mitchell taught me that day outside Buckingham Palace. He had every right to be angry, every justification for seeking revenge, every reason to dismiss me as just another arrogant tourist. Instead, he chose to treat me with dignity and grace, even though I could do nothing for him. Victor's voice became softer, more personal. That choice changed my life, not because it made me feel guilty about my behavior, but because it showed me what human beings are capable of at their best. It gave me a vision of the person I wanted to become. He looked directly at James again, seeing the same steady strength that had impressed him 2 years earlier. The young man who taught me that lesson is here tonight. He's now the Foundation's Director of Character Development, and his insights have shaped every program we've created. James Mitchell showed me that real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about how you help others get back up when they do fall. The audience began to applaud, and James stood briefly to acknowledge their appreciation before sitting back down with characteristic modesty. In closing, Victor said, "I want to share what I've learned about the relationship between personal transformation and social impact. Individual change and systemic change aren't separate processes, they're interconnected. When we help young people develop strong character, we're not just improving their personal lives. We're creating the next generation of leaders who will approach global challenges with wisdom, empathy, and ethical courage." Victor paused one final time, looking out at an audience that included former students, current teachers, Foundation supporters, and young people who represented the future he was working to help create. 2 years ago, I was a cautionary tale, an example of how wealth without wisdom leads to behavior we're ashamed of. Today, I hope I'm a different kind of story, evidence that transformation is possible when we're willing to learn from our failures and commit to serving something bigger than ourselves. He gestured toward James, Marcus, and the other Foundation team members in the audience. But I'm not the hero of this story. The heroes are the educators who dedicate their lives to developing human potential, the students who choose to grow rather than simply survive, and especially the young man who showed a foolish tourist that grace is more powerful than revenge. As Victor concluded his presentation, the audience rose and sustained applause. But what moved him most was seeing Marcus wiping tears from his eyes, proud of the man his father had become. Later that evening, at the reception following the ceremony, James approached Victor with a smile. "Excellent presentation," James said. "You've become quite the educator." I had a good teacher, Victor replied. That day you chose to respond with dignity instead of anger didn't just change my life. It's changing the lives of thousands of young people around the world. James shook his head. You're giving me too much credit. You made the choice to change. I just provided the opportunity. Marcus joined their conversation, along with several former students who had traveled to London for the ceremony. Mr. Pemberton, said Amara, now a confident university student, I have something to tell you. What's that? Remember that first day, when you asked if we'd ever done something we were ashamed of? Victor nodded. Well, I had. I'd gotten into a fight with another girl, and said some really cruel things to her. I was planning to make it worse when I saw her again. But, after hearing your story and James's response, I decided to try a different approach. What did you do? I apologized. Not just for the fight, but for the cruel words. And then, I asked her if she wanted to work together on a project for your class. Amara paused, smiling at the memory. She became my best friend. She's here tonight. Actually, she's studying at Oxford now. None of that would have happened if you hadn't shown me that it was possible to choose differently. Victor felt overwhelmed by the realization that his moment of worst behavior had somehow led to this. A room full of young people who had learned to make choices based on their best rather than their worst impulses. As the evening wound down, Victor found himself standing outside the building with James and Marcus, looking up at the London sky and reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. James, he said, I need to ask you something I've been wondering about for 2 years. What's that? That day at Buckingham Palace, when you made the choice to help me instead of destroy me. How did you know it would lead to something positive? James considered the question carefully. I didn't know, he said finally. I just knew that responding with cruelty would definitely lead to nothing positive. Sometimes the best decision you can make is to close off the path that you know leads nowhere good. Victor nodded, understanding that this wisdom was exactly what they were trying to teach young people around the world through the Foundation's programs. Besides, James added with a smile, my great-grandfather always told me that the measure of a person isn't whether they fall down, but whether they help others stand up. That day, it seemed like you needed help standing up. As they walked through the London streets toward their hotel, Victor reflected on how completely his definition of success had changed. 2 years earlier, success had meant dominating others and accumulating wealth. Tonight, success meant knowing that thousands of young people around the world were developing the character and wisdom to create a better future. The man who had once spat on a royal guard had learned that the guard's response wasn't just about that moment. It was about the ripple effects of choosing grace over revenge, understanding over anger, and service over selfishness. Those ripples were still spreading, touching lives in ways Victor was only beginning to understand. And, in the quiet of the London night, walking alongside the young man who had changed his life and the son who had learned to respect him again, Victor Pemberton felt something he had never experienced during his years as a billionaire businessman. The deep satisfaction of a life well lived in service to others.